Hi, everybody. I'm sorry again to have this be late. I was terribly sick all weekend. I don't know if you can hear it. My voice is still really froggy. But it is better than it was. I didn't have a voice at all on Saturday. Real quick before we begin, I have some housekeeping stuff. So all of the grading for Module 1 is done. I should be through the last of the essay questions sometime tomorrow, and then Module 2 will be done. Um, and then I plan to get to Module 3 in the next couple of days, and hopefully I can get to Module 4 before you all take the midterm next week. Don't forget, the midterm is next week. We'll talk about it at the end. I have some info about it. A note real quick about the grading. Pretty much everybody is doing pretty well. Everybody, for the most part, is sitting somewhere solidly in the A range. There are a couple of people that are down in the 70s and 80s in the C and B range. I don't really like to see it. In 100% of cases where that is happening, it is 100% because you're turning your work in late and you're losing points, because you're losing 5 points off the total grade for every day that's late. So if you turn it in after 4.2 days, then that's 5 days late and you've lost 25 points. So the highest score you could possibly get on it is a 75, is a C, right? So that's doing you great harm. Because this is late, I'm going to give you a day's extension into next Monday night at 11:59 to turn in your Module 4 stuff. So that'll be the due date. And then at the end of the week, like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday-ish, I'm going to put up your midterm for 48 hours, and then you'll have one chance to take it timed for 2 hours in that 48-hour window that I'll have it up. We'll talk about it at the end. So if you are one of those people who has one of the lower grades, not that C's and B's are terrible grades, but they could and should be higher. Do try to get your work in on time, because it is doing you a disservice. It's one of the tricks of online classes like this. Like when I was a student, I can't take classes like this. I can teach classes like this, but I can't be a student in them because I have to be held accountable and I have to go and turn work in physically in person, or I won't ever turn it in because I'm a terrible procrastinator. So I learned that very early on. Don't take online classes. Some people do great with them. They're great motivated self-starters and they can just get it done. I'm not one of those people. You may not be one of those people either, and that's okay. You don't have to be one of those people. Just know that you do need to keep up, and you stand a better chance of doing well in the class if you're getting your work in on time. The other thing I wanted to mention is the discussion posts. So I'm making this change from the syllabus. First of all, several people are not doing the discussion posts like at all. So if you find because I've done the attendance for the first 2 weeks, the attendance and participation, and basically what I'm doing every week is I'm keeping a total and then I'm just adding and averaging. And so I'm keeping a running average of your discussion boards, right? So if you posted a paragraph's worth of something on the discussion board for that week, by the time it was due, you got 100. If it was late, you lost 5 points for every day that it was late. If you didn't post anything at all, you got a 0. Those zeros are going to hurt later. So don't skip the discussion board. I will not require everybody else to post 2 comments on other people's posts, because right now people aren't really doing the posts anyway. So as long as you post one thing in it, you'll get your full attendance, okay? And that's a 100. Unless it's late, then it's 5 points off for every day up to 5 days. Then I don't take it. So the lowest that you can start on the 5th day is a 75. And then yeah, I'll keep a running average of it week to week to week as I get them graded. Great. So let's jump into the Renaissance theater, but let's face it, mostly Shakespeare. And there is a reason for why we're going to privilege Shakespeare, and we are going to spend quite a bit of time here in the beginning in England talking about the Elizabethan theater and Shakespeare. And the reason for that is because we are Americans. American audiences, American theater artists, you will be confronted with Shakespeare again and again and again. It gets done absolutely everywhere, all the time. And his plays are generally pretty good. I mean, he wrote some bad ones, but like they're generally really pretty good. He's the best English language dramatist and probably the greatest English language poet. So he does a lot of seeding the foundation of our own theatrical tradition in a way that some of the stuff in like Spain, Italy, and France really doesn't, even if it is interesting. All right. And we are going to try to get there. If we do not get through all 4 countries today, given the size of the lecture and how many slides there are, then whatever we don't get to, I will reserve till after the midterm, and you won't be tested on it. It'll go into a lecture after the midterm, and it'll be for the final exam. This is a 3-credit-hour class, so theoretically you should be getting 3 hours of online lecture from me in these slideshows, and then I shouldn't be giving you more than 9 hours worth of work to do in addition to that, because a 3-credit-hour class should take 12 hours a week, including the 3 hours that you theoretically spend in class, even though this is an online class. But this is your class time here. So I have 3 hours to get through what I can get through, and then I gotta cut it, and whatever I don't get through, we'll do on the other side, okay? So you will only be tested on the stuff through the end of this lecture and the lectures before it. And then you can leave all of this behind because it will not follow you on the other side of the midterm to the final. There is not a comprehensive final. You do not need to recall the first part of the class to get through the second part. All right. So let's talk about it. When last we were in Europe, we were in the late medieval period. And remember, for 500 years, secular drama is outlawed across Europe after the fall of Rome because the Catholic Church kind of takes control of things. It's a 500-year ban. And then when theater does return, it returns, remember, as part of the Easter Mass in the cathedral. As a result of that being successful, theatrical performance became widespread as a tool for religious instruction, supported by the church and the community. Remember, because we have the trade guilds, right, that build the pageant wagons for the cycle plays and et cetera, et cetera. So what we didn't cover last time about medieval Europe, but we did cover about Japan in our last lecture, is that Japan is a feudalist agrarian system. Well, hey, guess what? So is most of Europe. But it's a different kind of feudalist system. So if you just look at the bottom 2 rows of this pyramid, you can already see big differences. Whereas the Japanese had the farmers and the craftsmen on that row and then put the merchants below them, the merchants, farmers, and craftsmen here are all on the same row. And below them are peasants and serfs. Well, what are peasants and serfs? Well, slaves, indentured servants, and like field laborers, like farm workers. Merchants, farmers, and craftsmen are skilled, right? So they have a higher place in society because to be able to be a blacksmith or to be able to be a bootmaker or to be able to be a glover or a farmer or, you know, the ability to buy and sell goods wholesale makes you more important than somebody who just is like out hoeing the vegetables, right, in the field. Above them, you have knights and vassals. These are the vassals are kind of the servants of the knights. And again, these are the protectorate, right? They offer the police protection and the military protection. Above them are the nobles, the minor aristocrats, the dukes, the counts, and the countesses and the duchesses, etc., etc. And then above them, the monarch, the king, and later the queen. And they are the final authority in the country. We're still dealing with land grants here, like in Japan, but all of the land in the kingdom is owned by the king or the queen, and they are the ones that grant the land, okay? So that is what feudalism kind of looks like, but then there's one other catch in Europe, which is over the monarch, you see there, the Pope and the Church, in the medieval period, very much in charge of everybody, and they are in complete control of Europe, all right? And that started after the fall of Rome, remember, when the Visigoths invaded in 476 CE. And they have such total control of Rome that they have authority over all of the monarchs of all of the kingdoms there. Plus, they have created, with the smaller independent states, something called the Holy Roman Empire, and then they have handpicked and appointed someone to be Holy Roman Emperor, a Habsburg, and he is completely under the thumb of the Pope. So they have complete power in Europe. The Catholic Church is running everything. And that goes until about 1200 CE, and then it peaks. And then the church starts to lose its grip, and there are several reasons why. The biggest of these is that there are internal factional divisions that develop inside the church, and there's infighting. There is a movement for reform inside the church. Why is that? Well, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the Catholic Church, at the point where we enter the late medieval phase and are moving into the Renaissance, is extremely corrupt. And there are a lot of things that the reformers want changed. One of the biggest ones is that the church has been guilty of selling indulgences. And what this means is basically if you have some gold coins that can cross a cardinal or a bishop's hand, then they will sell you a get out of jail free card so that when you die, you don't have to go to hell because you have an indulgence. So you don't have to do good works and you don't have to do good deeds and you don't have to be a good person while you're on earth. You can just cross the cardinal's hand with some gold or silver and ta-da, you're going to heaven. Obviously corrupt, right? Simony and nepotism. Simony is the practice of selling offices to the highest bidder. And nepotism, of course, is favoritism where you place people based on who their relatives are. There was a lot of that going on in the Catholic Church at the time. Absenteeism and pluralism. Pluralism means there was a bad habit going on at this point in time where a person, because of the simony and because of the nepotism, a person could be appointed to several offices inside the church at once. And then they would be getting credit and sometimes money for doing these jobs, but they weren't doing the jobs because they had too many and they were in a different place. And so there was a lot of absenteeism because nobody was actually showing up to fulfill the duties of the office. They were just taking the job and then not doing it, right? Also around this time, you had several priests, cardinals, even a couple of popes whose public behavior was obviously not according to church teachings. There's some priests, cardinals, bishops, monks, nuns, and popes who had illegitimate children, for example. Obviously, that doesn't really fly in a religion that's expecting you to take a vow of chastity, right? And then finally, the accumulation of vast wealth and political power, which, as the church gets more powerful, it accumulates more and more stuff, more and more money, more and more gold, more and more art. And clearly, this should not be the mission of the church collecting this stuff, right? All of the reformers are inside the church, though. They're all Catholics, and they all just want to reform the church. They don't want to change the church, and they don't want to break from the church. They just want to see reforms happen. Reforms are very slow to happen, though. And what ends up happening is that the Pope begins to lose his grip on the kings in the various monarchies, and they begin to realize that they can challenge him for authority and to exercise autonomy and make their own decisions without the Pope telling them what to do. And some of them realize that the most effective way to do that is to secure influence over the Pope. So in 1305, a crazy thing happens, and you have French soldiers literally capture the Pope and forcefully move the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, and then they keep the Pope a captive of the French king in Avignon, basically, from 1305 to 1377. That is 72 years that they are stuck in Avignon. And they finally get out of that scrape, and then you run into this thing where multiple kings start declaring themselves Pope. From 1378 to 1417, there were actually 2 people claiming the authority of the Pope, and at one time after that, 3 different people were claiming to have the authority of the Pope. So clearly, the grip on power here isn't holding, right? And there are big social changes afoot because of it. We've been through the medieval period, right? We had famines and we had the bubonic plague, which has wiped out more than half of the population of Europe by this point. That leads many people to doubt the ability of the Catholic Church to protect them, because where were they and why did they not stop that? Why could they not use Jesus and God's power to stop that awful famine and the death of half their town, right? But they couldn't. Ironically, on the other side of that, the decline in population because of the famines and the plague actually leads to vast improvements in standards of living for the people who survive, and that leads to the feudal caste system and the boundaries between those castes breaking down, so that there's more social mobility going into the Renaissance in England. The internal reform movement in the church, yeah, that eventually will break out as we head into the Renaissance and become the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, who is a German monk, he gets very frustrated with the slow walking of reforms, and he makes a list of 95 theses. These are the 95 arguments that he has for the Pope, and he nails them to the door of a church in 1517 to send a message to the Pope. Now, what he doesn't plan for, of course, is that this dovetails very nicely with the development and invention of the Gutenberg printing press, which is the latest in technology. And when somebody, a monk especially, nails a list of 95 things he wants to complain about to the Pope to the door of the church, that gets attention. And that list of 95 theses got mass produced and printed and broadly circulated. And people were reading it. And it grew support for the reforms that Martin Luther was advancing, right? And what were those reforms? Well, very simply, they were sola fide, which literally means faith alone. Whereas the Catholics believe that good works and good deeds are what get you into heaven, Martin Luther says, nah, F that S, we're not doing that. Having faith alone is all it takes. As long as you have faith, you accept Jesus as your personal savior, you can go to heaven. You don't have to go to confession. You don't have to take communion. You don't have to do charity work. You don't have to tithe 10% of your income, on and on and on, right? No, faith alone. That's it. Accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior, basically. Sola scriptura, scripture alone. Whereas the Catholic Church has the Roman ritual and the catechism and a number of extra books of stuff, and often they were at this point in time in Latin, which nobody but the church people, like the cardinals and such, spoke. And Martin Luther says, no, just scripture, just what's in the Bible, and anything extra that the church adds on top of that, that should be supported in and like part of the Bible. If it's not supported by and part of the Bible, then it's not, we shouldn't have it. And a priesthood of all congregants. This is basically saying, hey, you know how the Catholic Church has this hierarchy of bishops and cardinals and popes and whatnot, and all these intermediaries between the congregation and God, like, to pass the message along? Yeah, you don't need that. Everybody in the church has a direct line to God and can speak to him directly, and they don't need this hierarchical structure of men in dresses to help them communicate with God, right? They don't need the Pope to be the infallible word of God on earth. And there are some others, but those are the main reforms that he's pushing, right? And then there are others that are also pushing for reforms with differences. John Calvin has the concept of predestination, right? Where everything that you're doing is already predetermined and it's part of God's plan. And the Anabaptists, who will later become the Baptists, who want adults to be baptized, right? The church gets very mad at Martin Luther, the Catholic Church, and they demand that he recant the 95 Theses. But when he refuses, they excommunicate him in 1521. That only serves to make the Protestant Reformation even more popular. We'll go into this in more detail later, but then in England, of course, it goes completely mainstream when King Henry VIII attempts to secure an annulment to his first marriage from the Pope. He can't get it, so he declares the Church of England a thing. The Act of Supremacy makes himself the supreme head, and then he spends the next several years reclaiming wealth held by the papacy that now returns to the treasury and the King of England. All right. This is also the era of European colonialism, so both Catholicism and Protestantism are driven global, while Europeans are colonizing the New World. Um, I do want to give a word of caution on this concept of colonization. And I'm going to say a thing that in academia is a very unpopular thing to say, but I'm sorry, it's a true thing. You will hear these days a lot of madness about decolonize everything, decolonize your bookshelf, decolonize the museum, decolonize the library, because it's all predicated on this idea that like colonialism was a flat evil, it was a terrible, terrible thing, it should never have happened. And here's the deal. Colonialism in some form or another has been happening as long as human beings have had consciousness and free will. It doesn't start with the Europeans in 1492, and it doesn't end with them either. Um, there are modern political forces who will use issues like colonialism and slavery, especially, because they're very potent historical issues that actually do have some bearing on our current politics. Both sides will use those issues and lie about the history in order to misrepresent it to their own political ends in the here and now. There is one side that will tell you that all of colonialism is bad and evil and awful, and those nice, noble indigenous people who were just completely peaceful and never had any war or any violence until white people showed up and started chopping heads off. Yeah, they're wrong. That's not true. And they're lying, probably intentionally. But so are the people who on the other side are telling you that, like, no, colonialism was a net good and everybody's glad that they were colonized, actually, and it made those countries a better place. And, like, no, that's not really true either. The truth exists somewhere in the middle. Nothing in the world is all good or all evil. Everything is complicated. Everything is nuanced. The people who were colonized by Europeans during this time suffered in some ways, and they benefited in other ways. And that's just the way that it is. And that's the way that it continues to be. So I would just say don't believe the hype, because it's all a bunch of lies usually when it comes to issues like colonialism and slavery, because they make very good scapegoats and boogeymen, and they're very easy ways to manipulate people into doing what you want them to do politically in the here and now. Colonialism, it's morally gray. It's both good and bad. There are benefits and there are negative things. And it's just the adult mature thing to acknowledge that. So that's my note of caution on colonialism as we talk about it going forward. What ends up happening because of colonialism is that European wealth and power increases exponentially. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands specifically begin scrambling for land in the Americas and the Caribbean, and they start bringing home all manner of cash crops, gold, tobacco, maize, corn, all kinds of stuff, you name it. Spain, actually, because they are the only people who don't laugh Columbus out of the room when he asks for 3 ships in 1492, have by this point in the early Renaissance become a major cultural and economic and military superpower. So, it's complicated. Theater is not immune from these changes. The end of medieval religious drama, and it is on its way to being outlawed in England anyway, it destroys the need for an international theater, which we have had through the Middle Ages up till now because the Catholic Church has been running the show and everybody's been following the same template. From this point forward, every nation will develop its own distinct style and character of theater and theatrical presentation. Okay? So now everything starts to break off into its own little strands. The end of religious drama and liturgical drama also forces writers to seek out secular sources, and suddenly, for the first time in centuries, we are now reading the Greek and Roman plays that survive. And this leads to a revival of creativity in dramatic literature, because now there's this whole world of secular tragedy and comedy that we can explore and begin to start working in, right? So let's start in England with Renaissance England, which in England they break it down by who is the ruler. So this covers the Elizabethan, Jacobean, and Carolinian periods. Elizabethan being under the reign of Elizabeth I, Jacobean being under the reign of James I, and Carolinian being under the reign of Charles I. So, Elizabeth I is the first Queen of England. Well, not technically the first, but the first successful Queen of England. She's the second after her sister, who she inherits the throne from right before this. Prior to that, England has never had a queen regnant, meaning a queen reign on the throne to control the country. So how do we go from having no queens in England to getting two back-to-back queens in England? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to Henry VI, who reigned from 1422 to 1461. His father was Henry V, and his father before that was Henry Bolingbroke, which is Henry IV. Henry IV and Henry V were pretty popular kings, but Henry VI is not. He is seen as weak and feeble and indecisive. His mind is febrile. He has bouts of like psychosis or mania or some other kind of mental illness that we don't really know what it was because they didn't diagnose that kind of thing back then, but he would go off on these adventures. Maybe he had like a serious bipolar disorder or something, or like some kind of schizophrenia. Anyway, he would go off the reservation and for like weeks at a time. And he just was not very dependable. Under his reign, we also end with England and France the 100 Years' War, which raged from 1337 to 1453 and was actually 116 years long. This was a long war between France and England. Don't worry, France and England have been fighting for like thousands of years without stopping. They will do it until like Napoleon is exiled the second time in the 19th century. But the 100 Years' War has been quite exhausting of the British military and of the English treasury. And so there is not a lot of faith in anybody in the Lancaster line where where the Henrys are coming from. So what ends up happening is there's a family feud in the Plantagenet family. And the Plantagenets are the royal family, right? And there are two houses of Plantagenets. There's the Lancasters, which is the Henrys, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, right? And then there are the Yorks, who are their cousins. And coming out of Henry VI's reign, Richard, the Duke of York, challenges the Lancasters for the throne and says, no, I think you guys have shit the bed with this. We're done with this. I'm taking the throne. Well, this sets off a series of civil wars, sectarian civil conflicts, known as the Wars of the Roses, which intermittently go off between 1455 and 1487. And this is a series of sectarian conflicts, like I said, between the two different houses of the Plantagenet royal family. Here you see their seals. The Lancaster rose is the red rose, and then the York rose, which looks almost identical to it, is a white rose. Who will win the throne? Well, the first round of fighting lasts from 1455 to about 1461. And Richard, Duke of York, who starts this whole ball to roll down the hill, he's actually killed in that first bout of fighting. And so he is not going to take the throne as he had planned, but his son Edward picks up the sword and continues fighting in his stead. And in 1461, he is victorious, and he is crowned King Edward IV, and he reigns from 1461 to 1470. During his reign, there is a kind of civil war that erupts within the Yorkist coalition, right? So Edward IV has a very close advisor named Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. And they get into a disagreement about some stuff, and Richard Neville schemes, and eventually succeeds to bring Henry VI back and restore him to the throne. And he does do that for a year, from 1470 to 1471. And then he is taken off the throne and thrown in the Tower of London. And then while he's in the Tower of London, he's murdered. And hey, guess what? So are all the other men in the Lancaster line. How strange. Oh, well, I guess Edward IV has to be king again. And he is. He's crowned again. And he reigns again from 1471 to 1483. Then he dies. And then his son, Edward V, takes the crown. Well, kind of. In 1843. Edward V is actually meant to be coronated, and as is the tradition, in the days before the coronation, he goes to stay in the Tower of London. He has a younger brother who is sent over a couple of days later to be with him, and then come the day of the coronation, both of the brothers have vanished without a trace and cannot be found. So Edward V and his brother are missing. They kind of go down in history as the mystery of the princes in the tower. They were in the tower, then they were not in the tower. Where are they? We don't really know. Are they dead? Probably. Who killed them? We don't really know. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, probably had a hand in it, though, for sure. Which is why, once they're out of the way, he seems to have no choice but to crown himself King Richard III, which he does in 1483, and he reigns until 1485. There is almost an immediate backlash after Richard becomes king, though, from the Yorkist coalition, because they don't like the way that Richard has taken the throne. This is pretty much a coup, right? I mean, he's pretty much just stolen the throne from the rightful king, Edward V. Nobody knows where Edward is. And there is a movement of Yorkists who break with Richard III, and they actually break into the Tower of London and try to rescue Edward V and his brother, but they can't find them anywhere. And there are rumors that they were killed and sealed up in the floor or sealed up in a wall and were kept there for a while and then later were moved somewhere else. In the intervening centuries, there have been a few skeletal remains of children removed from inside the wall and the floor of the Tower of London at various points in time. None of them has ever been definitively tested to see if they are Edward V and his brother, so we just don't know. We don't know what happened to them. But we can pretty safely assume that they're dead, and we can pretty safely assume that Richard III had something to do with it. And it's during this time that we start hearing peeps coming from a gentleman by the name of Henry Tudor, who is in exile, but who claims to be a distant Lancaster, and who has a claim to the throne on his grandmother's side, right? And Henry Tudor invades England in 1485. And he and Richard III meet at the Battle of Bosworth Hill, and Richard III is defeated by Henry VII. You may remember 10 or 15 years ago, they actually found Richard III's skeleton under a car park in England, and proved that he did in fact have a very severe case of scoliosis and was in fact a hunchback, just as Shakespeare said he was. There'd been some question about it. We don't know if he was the murderer that Shakespeare has made of him, but it does seem like he probably was. Henry Tudor is crowned King Henry VII after defeating Richard III, and he reigns from 1485 to 1509. So ultimate victory in the Wars of the Roses to the Lancaster house. Sort of? Not really. Henry VII's claim to being an ancestral Lancaster is incredibly weak, maybe non-existent, and he might be a pretender who's just captured the throne by force. He's very worried about being perceived that way anyway, so one of the first things he does when he's crowned is he takes as his bride Elizabeth York, who is from the York side of the Plantagenet house, and that unifies, symbolically, the two houses. He also creates a new seal for the Tudor royal family, which marries the white rose and the red rose from the York and Lancaster seals. There you see a picture of it, so that now they are one. These two decisions are pretty smart decisions, and they make him seem kind of inevitable. He looks over his shoulder for the rest of his reign in the hopes that no Yorkist is coming after him to challenge him for the throne. But they don't, because it would be really hard to do so when he's kind of positioned himself as such a peacemaker. And so what ends up happening is his reign ends up being a period of political stability, relative political stability in England, the first like really stable political period in 130 years, really. So you know, relatively, we would not call it politically stable, but for them, it was amazing peacetime. So, who will succeed Henry VII when he goes? Well, his son Henry VIII. But Henry VIII was not planning on being the king. As with like William and Harry, sometimes they're referred to as the heir and the spare. William is the heir and Harry is the spare. Such was the same of Henry and his older brother Arthur. Arthur was the heir, Duke of Cornwall and Prince of Wales, and Henry was the spare, who was never supposed to be king. Henry VII, the father, knew it was so important that Arthur would become the king that he had gone to a lot of trouble to arrange a marriage between Arthur and Catherine of Aragon from Spain. And this is strictly a marriage of diplomacy, right? They don't really marry for love at this point in time, particularly royals. They marry for political reasons, for financial reasons, right? And there were really three main goals of securing this union for Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. The first is Henry VII knew that this would secure Tudor legitimacy. Remember, Spain at this point, because they were the first ones kind of into the colonial game, and the first ones in the New World, they've become an economic and military superpower, right? Spain is a cultural center right now. And to have Spain acknowledge the Tudor king as the legitimate king gives the Tudor king a lot of legitimacy inside his own country. Because if Spain, so goes Spain, so goes everybody else, right? That's the idea. It will also enrich the country because the economy in Spain is hopping, and now there will be trade deals and commerce that goes between the two nations, right? And he's trying to bound England to Spain's superpower economy, right? England does not have the economic power of Spain. But if Spain can acknowledge England as a peer country, then they kind of get it without earning it, right? So this is brilliant diplomacy as far as it goes, right, to do this. It's very smart. And so Arthur and Catherine of Aragon of Spain are married in 1501. And then we run into a problem, because poor Arthur gets sick in 1502 and dies. And now he will not be king. So Henry VII is like, okay, well, now my other son Henry will have to be the king. That's fine. But now he needs Henry to marry Catherine of Aragon. There's a problem, though. The Catholic Church doesn't really like it when you marry your brother's widow so much. So they're going to have to get a special papal dispensation in order to make that happen. So they apply for special permission from the Pope. The Pope grants it. The diplomacy is preserved. The Tudors are legitimized. And all is well. And this will inadvertently lead to the Protestant Reformation in a few years. We'll see how in a minute. Because, see, now there's a crisis. Henry VIII takes the throne, reigns from 1509 to 1547. But he needs a male heir, and he's willing to cause a religious schism to get him. So Henry and Catherine of Aragon are married for about 26 years. In that 26 years, Catherine of Aragon gives birth to one daughter, Mary. And then there are several like stillbirths and like miscarriages along the way. But that's it. That's the only kid she ever has. Henry wants a son. He wants a son so that he has an heir to become king. And he's getting really impatient with Catherine of Aragon and all this stillbirth and daughters and whatever. So he petitions the Pope for an annulment to the marriage, which is crazy because they've already had a child. So how do you annul a marriage that you've clearly consummated? But anyway, he's going to annul the marriage because you can't get a divorce, I guess, really. And the Pope is not about to grant it because this is a conflict of interest for the Pope. Because remember how I said he installed the Holy Roman Emperor? Yeah, well, the current Holy Roman Emperor is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And now the power balance in Europe has shifted, right? And the Pope is underneath the monarchs. So now he is answerable to the Holy Roman Emperor. And this is a conflict of interest. He's going to get himself in a world of hurt if he crosses Catherine of Aragon on this. There's nothing he can do. He cannot help Henry VIII. And so he doesn't. And Henry gets impatient, waiting. So he finally just declares England split from the Catholic Church, invents the Church of England, which is a Protestant church in England, and then declares through the Act of Supremacy himself the supreme leader of the Church of England. Now he can grant himself an annulment, really a divorce, but technically an annulment, from Catherine of Aragon. So now they're divorced, and they had one daughter, Mary. He marries Anne Boleyn, who's one of her ladies in waiting. She is unfaithful, and she is tried for high treason and adultery and is beheaded at the Tower of London, but not before they have one daughter together, Elizabeth. Then he marries Jane Seymour, and honestly, it seems like Jane Seymour probably would have worked out. It seems like they got along okay. Jane Seymour gives him what he wants, one son, Edward. But she dies of complications from the birth shortly after he's born. After that, he marries Anne of Cleves, who is a German woman who he saw her portrait that Hans Holbein painted and thought she was hot AF. And then when she got there, he realized no, she had too many Instagram filters on her profile picture, that she was actually ugly AF, and that he wanted nothing to do with her. So he annulled the marriage, and she lived in one of his palaces for the rest of her life in the lap of luxury. Then he marries Catherine Howard. She also cheats, gets beheaded. They have no children. And his last wife is Catherine Parr. She actually survives him. By the time she comes along, he's an older man, very fat, has gout, can't hardly walk. She's mostly a nurse and caretaker while he's bedridden in his last years. She survives. They also have no children, right? So he does finally get his male heir. When he dies, that male heir, Edward, will ascend to the throne and become King Edward VI, who reigns from 1547 to 1553. He is 9 years old when he is coronated, and in 1553, when he dies of illness, he is 15. Very young. Does not rule a long time, is not an incredibly impactful king. He was a Protestant, like his father, and due to the fact he was so young, he ruled under a committee of Protestant regents, or rather, a better way to put it would be that a committee of Protestant regents ruled through him. He died very young, so he had no children. So upon his death, his throne would pass to his oldest half-sister, who is Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and a devout Catholic, right? He does not want to see England pass back to the Catholics. So before his death, he tries to name his cousin, his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as the successor to the throne. Lady Jane Grey rules England for 9 days, but Mary eventually deposes her, has her locked in the Tower, and later beheads her for treason. Mary I then becomes the first queen. She reigns for 5 years, from 1553 to 1558. Like her mother, she is a devout Catholic, and she attempts to restore Catholicism to England, like, very much. She tries to undo all of the Protestant reforms that Henry and Edward have pushed through, right? In order to shore up her Catholic bona fide, she marries Prince Philip, or Philip II, King Philip II of Spain. And she earns the nickname Bloody Mary because her persecution of Protestants is violent and terrible. She is quite cruel to the Protestants. She also has no children, so on her passing, the throne passes to the last living child of Henry VIII, her younger half-sister, Elizabeth I. And under Elizabeth, we finally get Renaissance in England. Elizabeth reigns for 45 years, from 1558 to 1603. She restores Protestantism as the main religion in England, But she attempts to strike a balance that her father and her brother did not, and certainly her sister did not, that will satisfy both Protestants and moderate Catholics. The hardcore Catholics are going to hate it either way. Um, she establishes what's called the Elizabethan religious settlement as a way to do this. Basically, this is a law that states that from henceforth, the Church of England is going to be our national church. We're going to have church services in the vernacular, in English. We're going to have a Bible that's in English, and we're going to have the Book of Common Prayer, and that's going to be our texts. And we're going to do this just as simply as we can do this. And this drives Catholicism underground. The Catholics become crypto-Catholics, right? They kind of have to do it in secret, but they're not being persecuted necessarily for doing it, as long as they're not doing it in the open. And again, if you're a moderate Catholic, you can kind of pass as a Protestant with the way that she kind of sets these rules up. The 45 years of her rule are a golden age of English culture and exploration around the world. Truly. She never gets married. She has no children, and her nickname is the Virgin Queen. Was she actually a virgin? We have no way to know that. She claimed to be married to the people of England, to the state, which is why she never married, because her responsibility was to her office as queen. So let's talk about drama in this time period. The Renaissance arrives late in England. This is primarily because we've been through that long war of accession over the throne, right? And the 100 Years' War, and there's just been a lot going on. When it finally does come, there's a big hangover of medieval performance characteristics, and they continue to be part of the Elizabethan, Jacobean, and Carolinian aesthetic. It still is very, no sets, kind of in these kind of open air places, and that's just what it is. It's not the case in like France and Italy, but it is, and even at the court here, but it is the case in the public and private playhouses. Oxford and Cambridge begin to bring scholars and artists from the continent who've been studying in like France and Spain and Italy. And they are humanists. And humanism is a new thing. Basically, the humanist philosophy, I think I define it later, but it's basically, unlike the kind of Catholic vision, which is that like your duty on earth is to suffer so that you can be saved in the afterlife, right? And go on to heaven and salvation. The humanists say, life is for living, and you should enjoy it while you're here, because it's not about suffering. It's about kind of seizing the moment and living in the moment and being in the moment and being a human and enjoying your life, right? And so this is a new philosophy at this point in time, and the humanism, it spreads. People get really, really into it. The first humanist drama in London is performed in 1497. It's Medwall's Fulgen and Lucrece. And the humanists at Oxford and Cambridge are teaching the classical Greek and Roman plays, which most Brits have probably not read since ancient Roman times, since Hadrian, was building his wall there. So it's been centuries since, these plays are being rediscovered in this moment, right? In 1561, the first original English tragedy is performed. It's called Gorboduc, or Ferrex and Porrex, by Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton. And it is based on distant English history, pre-Norman invasion, early British kings, Anglo-Saxon king. Plays in the early Tudor drama, or early on in the British Renaissance, are often a mishmash from a bunch of different sources. So they'll take classics and mythology and the Bible and popular foreign novels and like chivalric tales of brave knights and whatever, English history, low comedy. They'll take it all and they'll mash it together into a story that's just like whatever. I love the title of this play. I think it sums up this problem perfectly. And this is a play that premiered in London sometime around 1561, and it is called A Lamentable Tragedy Mixed Full of Pleasant Mirth, containing the life of Cambyses, king of Persia, from the beginning of his kingdom unto his death, his one good deed of execution, after that many wicked deeds and tyrannous murders, committed by and through him, and last of all, his odious death by God's justice appointed. And that masterpiece was written by Thomas Preston, whoever he was. I love that title. There's a lot going on in that play, and not any of it sounds like it belongs together. I love it. What ends up happening, though, in the Elizabethan drama is that there is this maturation of the playwright, right? So this kind of starts out of the Inns of Court, right? The liturgical drama is getting outlawed slowly as Protestantism spreads. But the university men will belong to these Inns of Court, and they'll have different Inns of Court for different groups of people. If you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be a judge advocate, or you want to be an accountant or whatever, everybody had their own Inn of Court. And then they still used the kind of medieval amateur, like, let's get a guild together to put on a play kind of attitude. And then they would use theatricals as a way to educate and do professional development. So these guys at Cambridge and Oxford are learning this honest in the Inns of Court and practicing this. You also have in the playhouses themselves, toward the front of the house, what is called the Wits' Row. And this is where the smart, funny people will come and sit who will heckle and make fun of the play, right? And there's a group of these that become very popular. And it's a bunch of young college students, and they become known as the University Wits. And they are Thomas Kidd, John Lyly, Robert Greene, and Christopher Marlowe. All of these will become dramatists of their own accord, and they will all be actually quite significant writers themselves. Thomas Kidd writes a very famous play called The Spanish Tragedy that premieres around 1587. John Lyly's most famous play is Love's Metamorphosis from around 1590. Robert Greene's is James IV from around 1591. And then, of course, the best known of these is this handsome fella right here, this little Twinkie-looking fella, Christopher Marlowe, who wrote Dr. Faustus, which premiered around 1588, and The Jew of Malta, which premiered around 1590, among others, but very popular playwright in his day, for sure. The group of playwrights that comes a decade, 15 years after them is even better, right? They're contemporaries, but they're a little bit younger, and this group includes Ben Jonson, whose most famous plays are Volpone, which premiered in 1606, The Alchemist from 1610, and Bartholomew Fair from 1614. Thomas Dekker, whose most famous play is The Shoemaker's Holiday from 1599. Thomas Heywood, who wrote A Woman Killed with Kindness in 1603, and Thomas Middleton, whose most famous plays are The Changeling from 1622 and 1623, The Spanish Gypsy. But none of these equals in comparison to the great William Shakespeare, who lived from 1564 to 1616. It's believed that he got to London and started working in the theater as an actor sometime between the years of 1585 and 1592. We're not sure exactly when. We do know that in 1594, he is named a shareholder in the Chamberlain's Men, which is an acting company, and he is entitled to profit sharing in that company. So we do know that by 1594, and there are much better records after 1594 because there are records on the Chamberlain's Men that still exist. Those years prior to that are really muddy. He remained with the Chamberlain's Men for the rest of his career as both an actor and their resident playwright. We know that he became a householder in the Second Globe Theatre in 1598. There were two Globe Theatres. The first one burned down. They built the second one. It opened in 1598, and Shakespeare was a householder, meaning he was entitled to a cut of the ticket sales, meaning he was an investor in the theater. And then he became a householder in the second Blackfriars Theatre, which was built in 1608 after the first one burned down. And he had to have been an investor in that because he was a householder there. So he was also entitled to a take of the door. When Shakespeare retires around 1613 and returns to Stratford-on-Avon, he does so a very wealthy man. So he was very successful in his day, and he dies in 1616. The playwriting is believed to have begun sometime between 1589 and 1592. We're not really sure. And we don't know which play he wrote first. But we do know that there is a small batch of plays, and all of these are written before he joins the acting company, right? Before he's in the Chamberlain's Men, he writes Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, Two Gentlemen of Verona, The Taming of the Shrew, Titus Andronicus, Richard III, and The Comedy of Errors. All of those are written before he joins the Chamberlain's Men. And then for the next 10 years, he averages one comedy and one tragedy per year. It's an impressive output. So 1594 to 1595, that theater season, he writes Love, Labour's Lost and Romeo and Juliet. The next year, he writes A Midsummer Night's Dream and Richard II. The next year, he writes The Merchant of Venice and King John. The next year, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. The next year, Much Ado About Nothing and Henry V. The next year, As You Like It and Julius Caesar. Now we're up to 1600, he writes Twelfth Night and Hamlet. Then he writes the next year, The Merry Wives of Windsor and Troilus and Cressida. Then the next year, All's Well That Ends Well and Measure for Measure. That is an incredibly impressive output, especially considering how good many of these plays are. Some of them are but most of these are pretty good. His output slowed down in the last 10 years of his career. And the plays that he wrote in the last 10 years encompass some of his very best and some of his very worst. Those are Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Timon of Athens, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, Henry VIII, and Two Noble Kinsmen. He also wrote two plays that are lost, maybe. One play that's lost and another play that's maybe not lost. The play that we know for sure is probably lost is Cardenio. It's one of his later plays. We see evidence that he was working on it. We see it written down places that he was working on it. We don't have a manuscript for it anywhere. It was never published. It was never performed as far as we know, and no manuscript has ever materialized. So that is more than likely a lost play. Love's Labour's One might be a lost play, or that might be an early working title for The Taming of the Shrew. We're just not sure. If it is a working title for The Taming of the Shrew, then obviously we have that play and we don't need to worry about it. If it isn't, then yeah, we've lost a play. So it is what it is. One of the great trademarks, one of the hallmarks of Shakespeare's work is that he writes complex, interwoven, and parallel plots that all coalesce together by the climax. And those plots are all peopled by well-rounded and believably human characters, which, you know, in the Renaissance is a tough ask. We haven't really had well-rounded, believably human characters in anything yet, but Shakespeare does give us some. I found this quote in one of the books when I was doing research, and I love this quote. I think I couldn't say it better myself. No playwright uses language as effectively as Shakespeare. His poetic and figurative dialogue not only arouses specific emotions, moods, and ideas, it creates a network of complex associations and connotations that transcends the immediate dramatic action. He is able to communicate with us on a level that most writers can't. And so it's not just about tapping into the emotion of the thing. It's about tapping into like the psyche of the thing, really. It's a tremendous gift, and no one at this time period was doing it. Across his body of work, Shakespeare used over 20,000 words in his plays and poems. He is a master, or was a master, at the poetic use of language. Very good at combining words together, turning nouns into verbs, adding prefixes and suffixes creatively in different ways. And because he did that a lot, he is claimed to have invented 1,700 words that are still in use in the English language. Here is a list. I will not read the whole thing. It is by no means exhaustive, but some of my favorite Shakespeare-invented words are fashionable, gossip, obscene, eyeball, worthless, zany, jaded, nervy, addiction, cold-blooded, dwindle, lackluster, moonbeam, swagger, uncomfortable, unearthly, accommodation, assassination, castigate, dexterously, frugal, generous, lapse, laughable, majestic, radiance, sanctimonious. These are great words, and he invented them all by mashing words together and kind of inverting their tense, reconjugating them. Very clever to communicate what he wanted. And 1700, that's a lot of words to invent. But we do know for a fact that he has the first written example of many of them. So let's talk a little bit about the publication of Shakespeare's plays, because this creates so many problems, you guys. There were two ways at this point in time that publication was happening and that Shakespeare's plays were published. One of these is in quartos, right? So at the printing press, they would have kind of an oversized sheet of paper. They would print the paper. In a quarto, they would fold that one sheet 4 times so that you could flip through it for 8 pages, right? Are you with me? If you fold it 4 times, you flip through it, you get 8 pages, right? So they're half the size of a folio, which is where you would just fold that piece of paper in half and get 4 pages, right? So folios are much taller. So quartos are smaller volumes. Usually they would only contain one play. There would be Hamlet as a quarto, right? And it would just be Hamlet, or just Macbeth, right? Or whatever. The quartos tend to be less reliable texts. We don't really know why that is. Copyright did not work back then the way that it works now. Patents didn't work the way back then that they work now. Once the playwright was paid the fee for writing the play, the company owned the play. But the Master of Revels owned and handled the licensing of the play. So it's very confusing. We don't really know why the quartos are the way that they are. We're going to take a look at the quartos and folios of Hamlet here in a second. But they tend to not be reliable. We think that either actors were putting them together from memory, or audience, people who had seen the plays, were trying to reconstruct them from memory, possibly. It doesn't really matter. They're not good, some of them, and there are questions of corruption and even authorship of what we're actually reading. 18 of Shakespeare's plays were published as quartos during his lifetime. The folios are the taller volumes. They are larger, more expensive. They usually contained multiple plays. Again, this is you fold the sheet in half, so you get 4 pages per sheet. And the folios are accepted to be more reliable texts because we assume that they were put together from the original manuscripts. The members of the Chamberlain's Men, for example, were involved in the publication of Shakespeare's folio, even though they were the first one was published in 1623, which was posthumous after Shakespeare had already passed. But the people who were putting it together would have been actors who would have known him, who would have been in the play, who would have had original manuscripts, who would have had access to his papers. So we trust the folios a bit more. The first folio had 36 plays in the volume. 18 of those had never been published before, as of 1623, when they appear in the folio. The third printing of the folio, the third folio, adds 7 additional plays to that 36, but only one of those, Pericles, is still accepted as Shakespeare's. The rest of them, we don't know whose they were, but they weren't Shakespeare. His play, Two Noble Kinsmen, is the only play that was never published in folio form, only as a quarto. All right, so this is a comparison of 3 different versions of the To Be or Not to Be speech from Act 3, Scene 1 of Hamlet. If you look all the way to the right at the one that's March 1st folio 1623, this is pretty much the speech as you remember it. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. So this is the speech right as you kind of know it. If you look in the center column at the good quarto, 1604 to 1605, this pretty much matches, except for capitalizations and punctuation are different. But the tax to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them to die, to sleep no more, and by asleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. See, it's the same. The punctuation is different, but and then you have the bad quarto from 1603. And here is that speech in the bad quarto. To be or not to be, aye, there's the point. To die, to sleep, is that all? Aye, all. No, to sleep, to dream, aye, Mary, there it goes. For in that dream of death, when we awake and borne before an everlasting judge, from whence no passenger ever returned, the undiscovered country, at whose fight the happy smile and the accursed damned. But for this, the joyful hope of this, hold bare the scorns of flattery of the world, scorned by the right rich, the rich cursed of the poor. This is nothing like that speech, right? It's like the Cliffs Notes version of that speech. Where does this bad quarto version come from? We don't know. Could this be an early draft? Sure, possibly. Could this be written by somebody else pretending to be Shakespeare? Yeah, possibly. Could this be from a Hamlet play that Shakespeare based his play on? Yeah, possibly. We really just don't know. And anytime I'm directing Shakespeare, I will go and find all the versions on the Folger library website, because they have electronic scans of these, and I will read all the quartos and folio printings just to see kind of what I'm dealing with. Right. Because you have to. You just kind of have to. And then as a director, you kind of have to make decisions. These issues with the publication in their day has contributed to a lot of the controversies around the authorship of Shakespeare's plays. This is not helped by the fact that at this period of time in England, there were a lot of dramatist collaborations, and a lot of the plays that are attributed to Shakespeare co-wrote with other people, maybe John Milton, maybe Christopher Marlowe, maybe Thomas Kyd. We don't really know. Or one of those people may have revised the play later, or he may have revised one of theirs later. The credits are kind of wonky because they weren't really interested in giving the playwright credit necessarily. So authorship credits are super muddy. This does lead for a while anyway. I think the furor for this has kind of died off in recent years for a movement called the Anti-Stratfordists. And the Anti-Stratfordists basically are the people that make the argument that there's absolutely no way that Shakespeare could possibly have written those plays. And it seems to be predicated on an awful lot of snobbery. Like, how could the English language's greatest playwright be the English language's greatest playwright if he didn't even go to Oxford or Cambridge? Like, God, he didn't even go to Yale. Who's his father? Nobody? Okay. So it does kind of reek of this kind of snobbery that I think is rather silly. Why couldn't he be the greatest poet in the English language? Shakespeare was born working class. His father was a glove maker. That is true. He did go to a public school, what we would call a public school. He didn't have the greatest educational advantage. He certainly didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, but that doesn't mean he couldn't write, right? He was not, in his day, the most popular or beloved playwright in London at the time. That honor would probably belong to Christopher Marlowe or Ben Jonson. Shakespeare's reputation today comes from a reappraisal that actually starts late in the 17th century, like in 1680 something. And then his reputation grows across the Anglosphere for the next 200 years. It hits its peak in the late 19th century, and then it kind of starts to fall off. But it's us now that are cuckoo for Shakespeare, and then he was fine. He was popular enough, but was he largely considered the greatest English language playwright in his day? No, not really. Probably not. All of this affects how we receive Shakespeare. So going back to the good quarto, bad quarto for Hamlet. I remember when I was in high school and Kenneth Branagh directed himself as Hamlet in a movie that was like 4.5 hours long and was the full text of Hamlet. And to me, that's really silly because Kenneth Branagh, the RSC trained actor, the Royal Shakespeare Company trained actor, of all people should know better, which is that, like, what is the full text of Hamlet? What we receive as the full text of Hamlet, what is in that giant book that takes like 5 hours to perform, that does not come from Shakespeare. That was put together in the 18th century by a book publisher who went through all the folio and quarto printings of Hamlet and took out his favorite parts from all the different versions and put together a Frankenstein version that we now receive as the full text of Hamlet. But that was never performed as Hamlet in Elizabethan times, probably. And we're not even sure that some of that stuff, like the first quarto, it belongs to Shakespeare or anybody. Where does that come from? Who is that? What is that? If that monologue is wrong, then probably the rest of the quarto is pretty bad too. It is called the bad quarto. So, there's a lot of issues with Shakespeare, but we just kind of have to take it the way that we have to take it because it's what we have and it's what we get. And, we don't know what we don't know. Um, and that's history, man. Uh, so remember that all through this time, Elizabeth I, in trying to settle this conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, is trying to quell religious strife. So she places strict laws against the performance of liturgical drama, and they are completely outlawed across England by 1581. All right. The Protestants, and especially a growing movement of Puritans, are vocal critics of the theater. They hate the theater. We've talked about this before. I told you the Christians always have had a complicated relationship with the theater. Yes, they have. That is going to assert itself here. Um, Now, there is a debate in the Renaissance period that did not exist in the Middle Ages because there are the first writings, the first kind of humanist ideas of neoclassical ideas about writing, and that theater can be a great tool for moral teaching. And those ideas are first put forth during the Renaissance, right? They're first put on paper during the Renaissance. So the Protestants and the Puritans are like, close the theaters, ungodly, unholy. And then you have a movement of other people who are saying, no, I mean, actually, there's a lot of opportunity for moral instruction here, and we just need to learn how to harness it and use it correctly. Professional companies of actors in the Elizabethan period in London required patronage from a noble person. Um, in order to be legal and to get a license, which is why the companies had names like the Queen's Men, the Chamberlain's Men, the Admiral's Men, right? Because the Queen, the Chamberlain, or the Admiral had to be the patron, had to sponsor the company, right? You would get your license from the Master of Revels, which was an actual government post that was like two people down from Queen Elizabeth, and they oversaw the licensing of the theaters and the companies and controlled the publication for all the plays performed in London. So if you wanted to start a company, you would have to get a license to have a theater from them. You would have to license your company from them, and then you were going to produce a new play. You would have to take the script to them. They would have to read it. They could censor it on religious, political, or moral grounds. There's nothing you can do about it if they decide to do that. And and if you want to publish it, you have to have the permission of the Master of Revels. He'll make the ultimate decision. The bubonic plague abates but does not really let go of its grip of Europe during this time and continues to have some flare ups. And when it does, the public theaters will be closed several times during the Elizabethan period in order to stop the spread of the plague. Um, so theater companies were arranged in those days as acting companies. There were two kind of paths for an acting company to follow. They could tour, or they could be in residence at a theater in London. Many did both, but touring at this point in time is a difficult undertaking because it's like you're taking a wagon. Most people are going on foot or on horse. You got to take your props, you got to take your costumes. You don't have a vehicle for really transporting this stuff. There's no airline travel, right? So you got to stay pretty close. It's tricky. It's difficult to travel. Um, Companies performing at the playhouses in London Had to have sponsorship from a noble gentleman to get the license. Um, and then, yeah, they had to license each individual play. The plays could be censored on moral, religious, or political grounds, and often they were. Each company had a manager. For the Chamberlain's Men, it was Richard Burbage, very famous actor manager, and then a company of actors under him. Shakespeare was an actor, but he also doubled as the resident playwright for the Chamberlain's Men. Once the playwright was paid his fee for writing the play, the acting company owned the play outright. So once they had a license for it, they owned it and they could perform it whenever, wherever they wanted. No women are permitted to perform in theater in England at this time. The women's roles were taken by young boys whose voices had not yet changed. This creates some highly subversive and interesting stuff that is happening in the comedies, which very often involve women appearing in disguise as men, where they then have love scenes with men. So you have boys playing women dressed as boys having love scenes with men, which just seems like for the 16th and 17th centuries to be incredibly subversive. But they got away with it. I don't know. So let's talk about the Elizabethan Playhouse. Plays at this time are performed in various locations. In yards, in the Inns of Court, and at tennis courts early on. Theater is often at this point in time competing with other forms of entertainment. Very popular ones include bear baiting and bull baiting. This is literally where you would go into like a little arena shaped thing, and then they would have like a bear tied up, and then like they would literally bait it and tease it and like torture it to death, and that would be the entertainment. They would do the same with bull. I wouldn't want to watch it, not much. That sounds awful to me, but boy, it was real popular back then. The theater becomes very popular in England during this time, and you see numerous playhouses being built on the east bank of the Thames River in London. If you look at the bottom, you'll see all of the east bank, those red dots, the Globe, the Rose, the Hope, the Bullring were right over here. In the old days, this is the only place that you could build theaters here. These get built later. These are private theaters, which are enclosed theaters. These bigger ones, these are outdoor, open air, public theaters. We'll talk about the difference. Right now, there are two types. Public theaters. Public theaters are open air, meaning they don't have a roof, that you are exposed to the elements. 13 of those were built between 1567 and 1623 inside London. The most famous ones that you need to worry yourselves about would be the Globe, the Rose, and the Curtain. They also have private theaters. This name is probably a bit of a misnomer because, you know how I was saying you needed a license for your company? Well, there were adult companies and there were boys companies. And there was a boys company working in a private theater that probably didn't have a license. And so the private theater for the enclosed theater was really just a trick to try to get around the Master of Revels by saying that, like, we don't need a license because this is private. I don't know if they got away with that or not, but the the roofed theaters were called private theaters after 1600 because of it. 8 of those were built. Blackfriars, Cockpit, and the Phoenix being the most important. If you look here, some pictures of an inn yard here on the left. And as you can kind of see, this could very easily be adapted into a performance area in the Elizabethan model. It looks not unlike the stage of an Elizabethan theater, which we are about to look at in depth. This is also what a Elizabethan tennis court would have looked like. They were usually indoor. And same deal. It's not really architecturally that different from the Elizabethan playhouse, right? And you would perform the play here on the actual floor of the tennis court. Because here is the public open air playhouse. See, so I said it was open air, right? You've got thatched roof over the gallery, but this area is completely open, right? There's a big hole in the center over the pit. So this is all cut away, but these seats would wrap all the way around. So you have gallery all the way around here to the stage. Here is the main stage down here. Then up here there was an upper stage. This would have been where you would have had your balcony scenes, your window scenes, right? Soft what lay through yonder window breaks, Romeo and Juliet, right? She would have been up there. He would have climbed up to her, right? So there's a door and a door for entrances and exits. Those would exit into the tiring rooms, which were areas for people to dress in. Upstage center, there was a little alcove with a curtain that could be pulled, and this was a discovery space, right? If in Hamlet, when Polonius goes to hide behind the arras and Hamlet stabs him through the tapestry, this is where Polonius most likely would have been standing, right, in that discovery space. He would have hid back there. Or when characters are discovered, right, they would slide that curtain and they would discover them there. There's a trap door in the main stage. This is perfect for the entrance of your various ghosties and other ephemera like that. The upstairs space in here would have been for wardrobe and prop storage. You have seating in the gallery, right? Seating up here for noble aristocrats and women who would have been segregated out. Down here, you would have had your groundlings, right? These would have been your cheapest tickets, standing room only. There would have been wenches walking around selling oranges. And then everything in the play would be performed here. This is a wood carving of the Blackfriars Theater. As you can see, we don't have a pit. We instead have these benches, right? So we have like a pew kind of situation, actual seating all the way down to the stage. Still the galleries up here, still the galleries up here, still the discovery space, still the upper stage. It's still pretty much exactly the same, except we got a roof. So we are enclosed, right? But functionally the same and functionally the same architecturally as these. So you can see how these things all kind of easily adapt. And I think you can see how the medieval tradition kind of stays with the Elizabethan theater. There's no fancy scenic effects. We're still just kind of performing in the environment in which we're performing, and everything looks like it's from today. There are no design sets on the Elizabethan stage. Costumes. The spectacle came from costumes, and there are records that they would spend large amounts of money on fabrics and dyes for costumes and stuff. It was in modern dress, like Elizabethan dress usually, but, they would spring for special costumes or for fancy costumes. The natural layout of the performance space would be used to create the world of the play. We've already talked about those features: the upper gallery, the discovery space, the trapdoor, and the tiring room. Those will almost certainly be on your midterm, though. In addition to what's going on in the public theaters, and the private theaters, which is where Shakespeare's stuff would have been performed, we also have a tradition of court masques. And court masques are held at private parties at the court of the monarchy and the aristocrats. They are held in celebration of a specific noble person. The mask that was performed at that party would dramatize a myth that paralleled or symbolized or somehow provided an apt metaphor for the noble person being honored. In Elizabethan England, you had to be licensed as a professional company by the Master of Revels to perform theater. The only people who were allowed to flaunt that rule were the nobles, the aristocrats, who were able to engage in amateur theatricals without a license at the court theater. And there they would often perform Italian and French plays that were popular in Italy and France, and they would do them in the Italian and French style. What do I mean by that? It means they would have fancy scenery, painted backdrops, sliding scenery, moving scenery, scenery machinery. All of that starts happening in Italy and France primarily, but we start to see it in the court theaters. The masks had ornate scenic designs in a proscenium theater arrangement, much like was going on in Italy and France at this time, which we're going to look at. One person you do need to know in relation to this is Inigo Jones, who lived from 1573 to 1652. He was an English architect who was the first significant scenic designer in the English theater. This sketch here is for a design of his for a court mask. It's just a sketch. We don't know what the design actually looked like because, of course, no photographs, but beautiful, beautiful drawing. The center point perspective, the forced perspective of it is really where we now can start getting beautiful painted backdrops, at least, and sliding for scenery. But we'll talk about it. After Elizabeth dies, she leaves no heir, and so the throne must, of necessity, pass to her cousin, who is already king of Scotland, James the Fourth of Scotland. So now he is James the Fourth of Scotland, yes, but he is now also King James the First of England, and he is England's first Stuart king. And so the royal family line has changed. He reigns from 1603 to 1625, and because he is already the King of Scotland, for the first time, England, Ireland, and Scotland are united as one, and the Jacobean period is ushered in. After he dies, he is succeeded by his son Charles I, who reigns from 1624 to 1649. He has a series of successive battles with Parliament, because from Elizabeth to James to Charles, there has been this steady slide into absolute monarchy and the idea that the monarch has absolute authority to do whatever they want, however they want. Well, there are a group of Protestants and Puritans who do not agree with that and want to see checks on the royals. So this leads to the English Civil War, which lasts from 1642 to 1651. The conflict is between Charles I and his royalist allies, and Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians. What's happening in the theater while all of this is happening? Well, the theater stays the same structurally: 5-act dramas, tragedies, and comedies end in a wedding. But they just get more decadent and more gory and more sexual and etc. So, two kind of typical plays of the period would be the Jacobean revenge tragedy, The Duchess of Malfi, from 1612 to 13 by John Webster. It reads functionally like any Elizabethan play, like any Shakespeare play, but it is incredibly violent, and the poetry in it is ugly imagery about rotting meat, decaying flesh, decomposition, and it has many hard-to-believe plot points. It is about a woman who is the Duchess of Malfi, and she is a widow, and her brothers are a duke, I think, and a cardinal, and they are trying to make sure that she does not remarry, because it would be a scandal if she did. Except, whoopsie, she's already secretly remarried and has a bunch of kids with her second husband, but it's all been a secret. And of course, when it comes out, everybody will have to be killed. At one point in the story, the two brothers of the Duchess, the Cardinal and the Duke, go to the trouble of like commissioning a bunch of wax figures of her family be built that look like they've been murdered, and then they place them around to trick her, and it's a really silly plot point, because it's like, you know, how long does it take in Elizabethan England to make these identical wax figures? Did the family have to sit to have their faces cast, you know, like a plaster cast done? Like, this doesn't really make any sense. And why would you go to all this trouble? Like, at some certain point, just send a hitman in and stab the bitch. Like, what are we doing? And there's a lot of that in there. One of the brothers turns out to be he suffers from lycanthropy, so he's a werewolf. Very strange. I've almost directed this play like 5 times, and I just never do, because the plot bewilders me, utterly bewilders me. During the Carolingian period, when Charles I is on the throne and we're having this English Civil War and all of this conflict, a typical play would be John Ford's "'Tis Pity She's a Whore" from 1633. It is still one of the most controversial pieces of dramatic literature on the English stage, primarily because it sensitively portrays the tragedy of an incestuous relationship between a brother and sister, and it still gives people the heebie-jeebies all these years later. The Puritans have been complaining about the theater for years, and maybe when "'Tis Pity She's a Whore" happens, they might have a point. It doesn't matter, because you know what? After the English Civil War, the Puritans take control. Charles I is captured by parliamentarians during the English Civil War, and then he is tried for high treason and beheaded in 1649. When Charles I is beheaded, the monarchy is abolished, and the kingdom is declared a republic as the Commonwealth of England. And Oliver Cromwell, who lived from 1599 to 1658, is named Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. This ushers in a period known as the Interregnum, and during the Interregnum, while we're under Puritan control, theater, again, will be outlawed for a few years in England. So let's jump over to Spain, to the Spanish Golden Age. Um, so, what has been up in Spain since the fall of Rome? Well, so much, you guys. Oh my goodness. So, after the fall of Rome, a few hundred years of Vandals and Visigoths living in the Iberian Peninsula. Eventually, like around the 700s, sometime, the coast of Spain is invaded by Moriscos. These are African Muslim Moors. And for a long time, depending on where you live, Spain is under Muslim rule for a century or seven in some places. Just depends where you live, how long their grip lasted. Um, the Catholic Church, of course, will take charge of this during the Middle Ages, and eventually Catholic rulers will be put on the throne, and a lot of the Moors will be converted or thrown out. We do finally get Habsburg monarchs in Spain. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella finally affirms Catholicism as the official religion of Spain. And after that, the Moriscos, the Moors, are deported from Spain in mass numbers unless they convert to Christianity. Ferdinand and Isabella's decision to fund Columbus's expedition turned Spain into an economic and military superpower. So take that, Portugal and Italy, who laughed at him. And then there's artistic flourishing in this new economic boom. Philosophy, literature, theater, and music are all having like a vibrant renaissance in Spain at this time. And oh, yeah, there's the Spanish Inquisition, the tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which is established with broad support from Spanish Catholics in 1478. Now, originally, this was started as a method to identify heretics among the Jews and Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula who had converted to Catholicism rather than go to jail or be deported when they were trying to run all of the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula. But the Inquisition slowly got its fingertips into all aspects of life in Spain. It lasted until the 19th century, and it is believed that as many as 150,000 people were tried before the Inquisition while it was operational, with between 3,000 and 5,000 people being executed for heresy. A major feature of the Inquisition was the auto da fe. This involved the accused being publicly paraded, having their sentences read publicly, confessing publicly, and then being executed publicly, usually by being burned at the stake. The Inquisition monitored and censored the content of literature and drama on religious, political, and moral grounds. So, again, we have a watchdog over the theater, and it is the Spanish Inquisition. It's also the watchdog over everything. So, Spanish theater in the 15th century. Unlike in England, where religious drama gets outlawed because of the Protestant thing, there aren't really any Protestants in Spain. It's all Catholics, and liturgical drama does not get outlawed here. It continues unabated. And so there are very famous plays in Spain at this time called autos sacramentales, which are allegorical dramas concerned with virtue and vice. They are not unlike the English morality plays, and they are very popular, and these would be performed as part of church services or produced by churches or by towns as part of religious celebrations. At first, the autos are produced by trade guilds, just as they were in England for the cycle plays, but later the production of the plays would be managed by the entire city or the entire town. The autos were performed on two-story pageant wagons called carros. This is an example of a carros. So it's very ornate kind of float, and then it's got two stories, and there's this whole area for acting stuff out in, right? Autos were produced in Spain until 1781, and then finally they were outlawed for being unholy. Much like in England, though, you get a flourishing of great writers in Spain at this point. And over 100,000 plays are written in Spain during the Renaissance. Many of those are still around today. You can still read them. Playwrights tend to write both secular drama and autos sacramentales. Some of the major writers of this period are Lope de Vega, who lives from 1562 to 1635. He is probably Spain's most prolific playwright in history. He personally authored over 500 plays. Among his most famous are Fuente Oveuna, which is the sheep well, and El Castigo sin Venganza, Punishment Without Revenge. Also popular writer at this time is Miguel de Cervantes, who lives from 1547 to 1616. He is widely regarded as Spain's greatest writer, and of course his most famous work is Don Quixote. Don Quixote is not a dramatic text; it is a story, a poem. But he does write some plays, among them La Numancia, which is the Seas of Numancia, and Los Baños de Angel. I'm terrible at Spanish, and I'm sorry. Tirso de Molina, 1583 to 1648. He is what I would call the Golden Age's sexiest playwright. He tends to write moral dramas that deal with lust and power. Famous plays of his are The Trickster of Seville and The Stone Guest, if you are familiar with the Mozart opera Don Juan, right? And then, like, the statue comes to dinner. Yes, that is from Tirso de Molina's play, The Stone Guest. So that is the source for Don Juan. And last, and certainly not least, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, who lives from 1600 to 1681. He is often called the Spanish Shakespeare. His most famous plays are La Vida es Sueño, Life is a Dream, and La Dama Duende, The Phantom Lady. So let's talk about the Spanish Golden Age playhouse. So plays in Spain at this time were performed in open-air public areas, usually in the courtyard of residential buildings, like an apartment building. And that courtyard would be adapted into a performance space, and that space would be called corrales. The corrales is in the open air, like the English public theater. So it would have been open to the sky up above. Here you see a picture kind of what we're dealing with. So this building wraps all the way around, right? There's apartments in here, in these units, right? And then there would be a place up here, like a balcony area for seating. This would be on the second floor. This would be the cazuela. This would be where the women would sit. Women were allowed to attend Spanish theater at this time, but they would be segregated for the men who would sit down here on the benches on the floor, the reserve benches, or in the standing area for the musketeros, right? So you would come in here through this door into the courtyard. There would be the standing area. Here you have gradas. This is the area where there would be elevated seating along both sides of the house, so that would be mirrored over here. And you would pay extra for that. And then the women would be up here where they would be segregated out. Here's your stage and your performance area over here. And then you have the aposentos, which are these balconies here for these apartments. And above that you have the divan, which are the attic or garret windows. And basically what would happen is that the theater companies would make a financial arrangement with the families that lived in those units and had the direct view of the corrales. They would cut some kind of financial deal with them so that they could use those windows as balconies and box seats. And that's where, like, the monarchy and the aristocrats would sit, right? They would sit inside those people's apartment on their balcony, looking out their window or whatever. And so this is where the majority of the plays were performed, both the autos and the regular plays, in the corrales here in the courtyard of a residential building. Like in England, they have court dramas, which are performed for the aristocracy at the court of the king. And like in England, that theater is a proscenium theater with ornate scenic design and plays that often treat mythic or religious themes. And they would be written by a lot of the same people. You would have Lope de Vega or Calderon or one of those guys writing them, right? So I just want to make sure that you are aware of that. This will definitely be, there's a question about it definitely on your quiz. Definitely this diagram is going to be on the midterm too. So yes, good thing to know. Do not confuse the carros, which are the two-story kind of pageant float wagons for the Autos with the Corrales, which is the courtyard theater for the public place. So before we leave Spain, I do want to take a minute to talk about La Vida es Sueño, Life is a Dream. This photo is actually from a production of Life is a Dream that I directed. This was my master's thesis. I think I mentioned it last week. I was talking about how I translated a Spanish Golden Age play. Yes, this is it. And I didn't like my translation either. And I didn't, and I don't. But Life is a Dream is a very interesting play, and I think it's very illustrative of what's going on in Spain at this time. Because this is a secular play, but it is also a moral allegorical play. So the play concerns this guy here in the brown is a guy named Segismundo. And at the beginning of the play, he is being held prisoner in a tower by his father, the king, Basilio. We're in Poland. And this lady here, Rosara, has just come from Moscow to get revenge on a duke called Astolfo, because he has taken her virginity and then left to come here to Poland to marry the princess, Estrella, in the hopes that he can become king, because the king is very old and the king has no heir, they think. But the king announces to the court that he does actually have an heir, a secret heir, that they never told anybody about, because there was this horoscope years ago, before the baby was born, that said that the baby would be a terrible, awful king who would bring civil war to the kingdom. And so in order to prevent this, they locked the prince in the tower and kept him prisoner from the time he was a baby until this very day. But now it is time for the king to step down, and now he feels bad about what he's done, and he feels like he owes his son Segismundo the opportunity to try to be king. So he comes up with this great plan. He's going to have his advisor, Clotaldo, give Segismundo a sleeping potion, put him to sleep. Then while he's asleep, they're going to bring him to the castle, dress him up in the finest princely clothes, and put him in the nicest, softest bed. And then when he wakes up, they're going to tell him that everything that happened in the tower was a dream. And that he's actually the crown prince and that he's going to be the king here. And then, he'll hopefully act right, and then he can be the king. So they give him the sleeping potion, bring him to the castle, wake him up. And of course, when he finds out that he's been in the tower all those years and that he could have been living here as the prince in the palace, he gets rightfully very upset. And he causes a big scene, injures some people, kills a servant. It's not great. And then he tries to rape Rosara, who is now hiding as a lady in waiting in the princess's court because her father is the king's advisor, but she doesn't know that yet. Anyway, so finally the king realizes that this isn't going to work out. The horoscope was right. So they give him the sleeping potion. They take him back to the tower. He wakes up. The king's advisor is there, and he tells him what happened. And the king's advisor is like, wow, that's a crazy dream that you had, even in dreams, you should behave like a good person because you never know what's going to happen. Da, 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 da. And this throws Segismundo into a terrible crisis because he doesn't know what end is up and what's real and what's fake. And he doesn't really know until Rosara and a bunch of the citizens of the kingdom, finding out that they do in fact have a rightful heir to the throne and that he is locked up in this tower, they come to set him free. And now he knows that everything that happened was real. And so he vows to avenge himself on his father, the king. And the civil war that was predicted now breaks out. And then he corners the king in the castle, and he is about to cut his head off when, in a final moment of grace, he decides to forgive him. And in that moment, he proves to everyone that he is worthy to become the king. And so he is able to become the king because he makes the wise and right and moral decision in the end, and does not cut the king's head off, no matter how badly the king probably deserves it. All right. And that is the plot of Life is a Dream. So as you can see, secular play, questions of kingship, questions of lineage of this kingdom in Poland, etc., but also these moral questions about like how we behave and how we act and what we do and the choices that we make, right? And are we good or bad inherently? So still very religious, very Catholic, even though it's secular. So let us jump now to Italy. Oh, good. This lecture isn't going to take nearly as long as I thought. So now we're going to Italy, Renaissance Italy. Italy is a little different than England and Spain. So what's going on in Italy? Well, the Renaissance arrives in Italy much earlier than it does in England or Spain. Sometime around 1300 is when it starts. The Catholic Church holds sway over the entire former Roman Republic and all of medieval Italy. But there's something about this region and their kind of tie to the former Roman Republic that allows them to develop these powerful city-states that are kind of modeled on classical Roman republicanism. So Genoa, Venice, Milan, and Bologna all are very important cultural and economic centers in Europe by the late Middle Ages. And they kind of transcend this Catholicism because they're a little more cosmopolitan, right? Humanism is the philosophy that carries the day in Italy. The liturgical dramas of the Catholic Church that were popular in England, popular in Spain as the Autos Sacramentales, they were never popular in Italy. So other forms of secular theater start developing through the Middle Ages, right? They don't have the religious drama. They don't have the outlawing of secular drama in Italy, so they have forms kind of developing. The Italian Renaissance really introduces the concept of humanism. We talked about it a little bit before. It's just the point that the point of life isn't suffering to secure salvation in the afterlife, that you should be able to savor and enjoy your life as you're living it. And that this attitude is what encourages much of the development in art, literature, music, and science during this time. Throughout the Middle Ages in Italy, we are still reading the plays of Plautus, Terence, and Seneca, even though we are not performing them. But they never lose them like they do in England, right? They're still being read. Playwrights begin to write plays in Latin modeled on those old classic plays, but they're not written to be performed. Performances in Italy don't begin until the late 14th century, the late 1300s. And the reason, when they do, first it's productions of ancient Roman plays that we've already seen. Then they start writing Italian plays in the vernacular. The earliest plays that are written in Italy are the first examples of neoclassical drama. Neoclassical because they're modeled on classics like Plautus, Terence, and Seneca, but neo because, they're new plays. They're not old plays. We have the development of a new genre in Italy, which is the commedia erudita, which is the earliest genre of Italian theater that appears. And these are comedies based on classical mythological sources, performed by and for nobles. They were not for the working class. One of the most famous of these is The Mandrake by Niccolo Machiavelli, who also wrote The Prince. The Italians decide during this period that tragedy should teach moral lessons, so now they tend to be tragicomedies. They tend to be sad plays that end happily. Unlike in England and Spain, the play is not the thing. We do not have a flourishing of great dramatists in Italy at this time. The playwriting does not get great in Italy at this time. What does get great in Italy at this time is the stagecraft technique. And here we see a drawing of a set for a show, right? Forced perspective, backdrop, right? We've got some stairs, we've got some sketches of some scenery. And that stuff in Italy and later in France really starts taking off. The 15th century Italians beat everybody to the punch on scenic design because they have rediscovered the text by Vitruvius called De Architectura, which was first written about 15 BCE. And you should think of it as the poetics of architecture and design because it's basically doing the same thing. It's basically laying out what are the rules of structure for architecture and design in classical Rome, right? And that's kind of what we're looking at. We have discovered single point perspective in drawing and art, so forced perspective scenic painting becomes possible, although it works best from center because it is single point perspective. So really, you're going to get the best view from center. But we start to get elaborate drops rigged and flown in and out of the stage house. We also start to get shifting scenery in the 17th century because we can have sliding panels of painted drops that slide on and off stage and into position, can move around guided on tracks pulled by pulleys in what's called a pole and chariot rig, and we're going to look at one of those in a second. In the late 1500s, Italy moves from performing in open-air gardens and starts building dedicated standalone enclosed theaters. And the designs of these theaters incorporate the proscenium arch, which is first seen in France in the ballet, in the dance theater. And this is a proscenium arch, right? And we've talked about it a little bit in the last lecture. Theoretically, it's a fourth wall. The audience can see in. The actors theoretically can't see out. Of course, the closer you get to modern times, the more likely they are to break those rules. We also begin to see the beginning of scenic effects through crude machinery. So Italian scenic designers create simple scenic effects with gears, wheels, pulleys, and rope rigging that allows for individual scenic pieces to move. Though the machinery is crude, the effects could be quite persuasive, even though they exist only in 2 dimensions. So if you look at this little thing we've got here, we've got this gear, right? We've got this guy on a platform over here. He's pulling some kind of rope or chain that is attached that seems to make this thing go around. As this thing goes around, these things will unspool, right? Here we have these 3 things. They're kind of tied together. We've got actors standing on one, right? So these are probably playing gods, right? The audience is over here. They're about to come down. So as those unspool, this will lower. As he tightens them back up, they will raise. It seems like no big deal to us, but, given the technology and the time, it's pretty impressive. There are 2 scenic designers that I've kind of noted here. One of them is Giacomo Torelli, a celebrated Italian scenic designer who invented the pole and chariot scenic system. This is the pole and chariot, right? So if this is your deck, right, your stage floor, this line right here, and this is kind of like your orchestra pit area under the stage, whatever. And this is your deck right here, the stage floor. Come back. Here we have, there could be flats on here, right? That we're moving, or here they've got like some trees that are on it or whatever. And then we've got these ropes that are kind of feeding, and this is on some kind of a track. So as these ropes move, it would cause these to shift towards center, and maybe they could crisscross behind each other, and maybe they couldn't, depending on how the tracks were cut out, and they can go off the same way, right? Super simple, pole and chariot, right? It's super simple. That's the pole and chariot. The other one that you should take a note of is Sebastian Serlio, also a celebrated Italian scenic designer. He invents the raked stage. If you've ever seen a show that is performed where the stage is taller at the back than it is at the front, it's kind of like on a rake, on a ramp. That's a raked stage, and often they will do that to reveal the floor to the audience. Shows that have a lot of dancing maybe will be on a raked stage. Cats was always done on a raked stage for that reason, I think. So let's talk about Commedia dell'arte, because this is probably the biggest form thing that's happening here. Commedia dell'arte literally translates to artful comedy. It is a comedy of players. It is not like the Commedia erudita. It's earthier and more lustful. It has more kind of dirty humor. Women are not performing in the Commedia erudita, but they are performing in the Commedia dell'arte. And this is a full century before women appear on stage in England. So Italians are far more progressive when it comes to that. The origins of the Commedia dell'arte tradition are muddy. We don't really know where it comes from. We believe that it's sourced in Atellan farces, which were a specialized Roman comedy based on rustic plays about country life. Those get preserved through the Middle Ages by strolling minstrels and mummer troops that continue to exist that keep them alive. Like Roman comedy and Italian farce, Commedia dell'arte is dependent on stock characters, and they would put those stock characters in improvised situations that then allow them to string together memorized lines and rehearsed comic bits called lazzi. A lazzo is literally a gag. Lazzi is just the Italianate plural. You drop the O, you change it to an I. Now it's more than one. There are volumes of books that outline the various lazzi that could be performed in the Commedia dell'arte, and they were often categorized variously. There were hat lazzi, food lazzi, pea lazzi, yes, that's true, butt lazzi, etc. Although the plots of Commedia unfold on the same lines as like Plautus and Terence comedies, audiences never know which lazzi are going to be incorporated into the Commedia by the players, or how the other characters are going to react when they do. So that's where the comedy comes from. What gags are you going to see, and how are the other characters going to relate to them? The stock characters and Commedia are based on regional stereotypes, so each one has a specific style of dress, a specific accent, and even often a specific food associated with them. There are three categories of stock characters in Commedia dell'arte: the masters or the vecchi, the servants or the zani, and the lovers or the innamorati. The vecchi, the masters, there are three types. I mean, there may be more, but there are three main types. The capitano, or the captain. He is a swaggering, bragging coward, not unlike the Miles Gloriosus figure in Roman, right? The Pantalone, he is the miserly merchant, not unlike the old man, right, in the Roman comedy. He's lusty and creepy, but the girls are not into it, so he is not romantic. And then there's Il Dottore, the doctor. He is always from Bologna. He's smart. He's usually involved in the grossest of the Pilazzi, and his wife is always unfaithful. Things you need to know about Il Dottore. So those are the vecchi. The zani, the servants. Arlecchino, or Harlequin, is wily, acrobatic, simple, and always hungry. Pulcinello isn't really defined as to like what this is, but they're from Naples, and their big thing is they're self-preservationists. They'll throw anybody under the bus to save themselves, right? And then Brighella, the schemer, who is mean and lecherous. And then the innamorati are the lovers, the young man and the young woman. They are the only actors in the Commedia who do not wear masks. So, like I said, all the characters in Commedia are masked except the lovers who go bareface. So, let's look at these. We didn't talk about all of these, but here is the prototypical mask for the Capitano. Notice the very long nose. Here's the Pantalone. He's got kind of this hook nose thing going on. The Dottore is like this headdress and like weird bulbous nose combo. Brighella, right? This is the self-preservationist one, right? Pulcinella, that's the undefined one, has this kind of bird hook nose. Here's just a general Zani servant mask. Arlecchino here. Columbina, that's the lady servant. We didn't really talk about her, but she's another one. So yes, these are kind of prototypical masks that you would see in Commedia. Commedia dell'arte is enormously popular, and as a genre, it lasts for centuries, and it transcends national boundaries. It's still around, actually. Slapstick is a direct inheritor of Commedia dell'arte. If you've ever watched The Three Stooges, then you've seen something of Commedia dell'arte because it's a direct inheritor of it. In fact, the slapstick comes from a Commedia concept of like the stick that would, you could hit people with the stick, it would make the slappy noise. That goes back to Commedia. We have many volumes of books of Lazzi that survive, as well as a handful of Commedia dell'arte scripts. Although those scripts are not very stage-worthy today, the way they are written. One of the most famous, by Carlo Goldoni, is The Servant of Two Masters. You will almost never see a production of The Servant of Two Masters, and when there was a successful revival a few years back, it appeared on Broadway and in London as a new play called One Man, Two Governors by the British playwright Richard Bean. So We're adapting, not necessarily reviving. One major thing that happens in Italy at this time during the Renaissance, though, is the beginning of musical theater, which is my area of research expertise, so I'm very happy to see it. That's right, opera begins in Italy during the Renaissance. It emerges in the late 16th century. The first opera performed in Italy is Daphne by Jacopo Peri in 1587. But it is not considered a very good opera, and it is actually Claudio Monteverdi's L'Orfeo from 1607 that is considered to be better written and more foundationally important. Early opera combines vocal and orchestral music with drama. Its direct predecessor were court spectacles called intermedi, which is literally a short musical work performed between the acts of a play, like in a court masque or something. Italian opera quickly develops toward opera seria, which means serious opera, literally. And that just means structurally it alternates recitativo passages with da capo arias. So recitativo are those weird sections of the opera where they're not quite singing, but they're kind of speaking, but it's not really on any kind of melody, right? So there's pitches and maybe a couple of like arpeggiated chords from the harpsichord underneath of it. But they're mostly just having dialogue in like kind of musical terms. And then that will switch at an important moment to a da capo aria. And a da capo aria, all that means is that it's written in an ABA form, verse, chorus, verse. That's it. In the early days of Italian opera, that's the form. The music will get much more complicated and much less complicated at various points and places in time and history as opera goes on, but that is Italy. So, cool. We're not quite 2 hours, and we are almost done, folks. We are on slide 62 of 69, so this is not as long of a lecture as I had anticipated. So let's move on to the last country on this little tour, and let's talk about the French neoclassical theater, which is what is happening in France during the Renaissance. So what's been happening in France while we've been in Japan and other places? Well, religious conflict, lots of religious conflict. There has been civil war between religious sectarian groups in France for many years. And much like the Brits, they've just wrapped up the 116 Years' War with England. So also they are having some hurt from that. The Renaissance arrives very late to France, not getting going until the late 15th and early 16th centuries. It's still earlier than in England, but it's still late compared to the 1300 in Italy. Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and numerous aristocrats are highly supportive of theater arts in France. But dramatic literature doesn't mature as quickly in France as it does in Spain and England. They do a lot of thinking about classical dramas by Seneca and such forth for about a century before they start successfully writing plays in classical dramatic forms. The neoclassical form itself doesn't actually develop in France until 1550. And the way that that comes about is that there are a group of 7 French dramatists who call themselves La Pléiade, and they lay out the rules for neoclassical French drama. But after the production of a play in Paris called Le Cid by Pierre Corneille, the Académie Française takes those rules up. And if you're not familiar with France, the Académie Française is a bureaucratic academy. Their main role really in the culture, in the society, is kind of being the gatekeepers for the language. So every year the Académie Française meets and decides like what words will be permitted into the French vocabulary and what words will not. And I always pay close attention to this because I personally find a great deal of joy in it when they have to let words in like World Wide Web and Internet and television, which they changed the pronunciation of it, but it's television, and nobody is fooled. Because they really hate when those impure English words get in there. And I love that. Because they're not like us. Our language evolves organically over time, as people use it, and it changes, and words change meaning, and slang changes, and everything changes, and the way we talk changes. In France, they do not do that because they have this very bureaucratic academy who gatekeeps the language. And once upon a time, they also gatekept the standardization of the system for writing neoclassical drama. And what they kind of got it down to was 5 main rules, which they allegedly based on classical models. But they kind of out Aristotle, as you'll see here in a second, so we'll see. Number 1, verisimilitude. The action on stage must be believable. There will be no ghosts, no angels, no people flying, nothing like that. It must have verisimilitude. It must be true. Number 2, decorum. Drama should both teach and be pleasant. There should be no violence. It should uphold French morals, and there should be no sexual or scatological humor at all. No mixing of dramatic styles. Tragedy is sad and comedy is funny, and there should never be comic relief in your tragedy, and there should never be sad parts in your comedy. No, one or the other, never both. Stay in your lane. The unities. The play must embrace the 3 Aristotelian unities, and this is where I say they out Aristotle, because Aristotle does not say that plays must embrace those 3 unities: unity of time, unity of place, right, and unity of why am I drawing a blank on the last one? Time, place, and sorry, I had my copy of Poetics right here. My brain is broken. It's been a long day. But they want us to acknowledge all 3, right? The unity of time, that a tragedy must take place in 24 hours or something thereof, or that it must take place in one place. Aristotle doesn't really say that. He just kind of observes that in ancient Greece, that is kind of what is happening, right? But the French are like, no. You must obey all of the unities, all 3 of them. And finally, 5 acts. Dramas must follow a 5-act structure. No 3-act plays, no 2-act plays, no 1-act plays, no 4-act plays, 5-act plays only. So throughout the 15th and 16th century, there are popular plays that get produced in France, but there are no great plays during that time period, and there are no playwrights who really distinguish themselves as great playwrights. But by the mid-17th century, 3 such dramatic masters have appeared. The first of these is Jean Racine, who lived from 1639 to 1699. He is kind of the picture of neoclassical perfection in the way that he structures his plays. His most famous play is Phaedra, based on the Roman myth. Phaedra, her husband is away, she's in love with her stepson, it all ends tragic. It's based on an old Roman myth. Very popular, very famous play. Very beautifully structured in the neoclassical style. Neoclassical isn't my favorite. It's a little too boxed in for me personally, but as neoclassical goes, that is a very good play. Pierre Corneille is the next. He lives from 1606 to 1684, and he is the one who will break the neoclassical rules. He wrote the play Le Cid, which is the reason the Académie Française got involved in setting these rules anyway, and that is because Le Cid is kind of all over the place in terms of like what's going on in the action of the plot, and it does not really conform to a lot of neoclassical standards as the Academy would have them. It was a highly controversial play upon its premiere. It's actually a very entertaining play, but it was very controversial upon its premiere, primarily because it violates all of these neoclassical rules. But Corneille was never really one to follow them, even though he kind of was, he kind of wasn't. And then lastly, we get Molière, 1622 to 1673. His plays mostly satirize the bourgeoisie. His most famous play is Tartuffe, which is a satire of religious hypocrisy. Most French dramatists at this time write plays in a metrical line called Alexandrine. So it's a 12-syllable line of iambic hexameter. So we're still dealing with alternating patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables because it's iambic, but it's in hexameter, so it's in six. So it's literally six syllable phrases linked together with a caesura or a breath, a pause in the middle. And that is the rhythm of it. This is why Moliere doesn't translate to English, because the Alexandrian line doesn't translate. And it's why Shakespeare doesn't translate to French, as we talked about last week, because the iambic pentameter line does not go into the iambic pentameter line, which is 10, right? Syllables per line. Yeah, this is 24. So it's just, yeah, it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. Great. So during the Renaissance, France begins to build new theaters, ornate, beautiful new theaters. At first, they start designing them for medieval style scenery, and much like kind of what's going on in Elizabethan England, but later they come into their own and adopt the same kind of impressive designs that Italian Renaissance theaters are pursuing. And the same kind of stagecraft. Everyone in France was permitted to attend the theater, though women, if they attended, would often go masked to avoid scandal. Whereas at the English playhouse, there would be a wench, literally an orange wench, who would walk around and sell oranges at the interval. The French theater offered macarons, which I prefer better than oranges personally, but, up to you. Acting companies in France at this time were typically made up of 8 to 12 actors plus a couple of apprentices. After 1607, women are freely allowed to perform on the stage in France. The French equivalent of the court masque is called the ballet du corps. You can guess what evolves out of these masks in France. Why, yes, it's the ballet, which becomes a popular entertainment in its own right. Like in Italy, there is an explosion in the popularity of opera in France. Perhaps the most important composer of opera in France at this time is Jean-Baptiste Lully. He lived 1632 to 1687, and he is France's first great composer of classical music in the Baroque style, because this is the Renaissance and Baroque is the music of the day. He called opera tragédie mise en musique, which literally means tragedy set to music. Unlike the Italian opera, which was moving already toward the opera seria, which alternates the recit passages with the da capo arias, French opera does not alternate between those two things, but uses various forms, like airs, which are kind of a lighter aria, rondos, which are songs in a kind of like A, B, A, B, A kind of form, and vaudevilles, which are just satirical songs. All operas in France at this time culminate in a living tableau involving all the singers and the corps de ballet, and some kind of scenic, stunning scenic effect. This illustration, this painting, seems to be giving us one here. Although what exactly we're looking at, I'm not sure, but it's beautiful. Great. And that is our lecture, and we are wrapping up at 2 hours and 6 minutes. I'm very impressed. So, the viewing this week, the only other thing you have to watch besides this lecture is A Midsummer Night's Dream. We're going to watch this production from 2014 that was directed in New York by Julie Taymor. It's about 2 hours and 25 minutes long. It's a very good, very innovative, very interesting production in a kind of black box arrangement. Fairly well performed and interestingly directed. Not great directed, but I don't think anything Julie Taymor does is great directed. It's always visually very fascinating and beautiful, but sometimes the performances are... But I think you guys will enjoy it. I did enjoy it when I watched it. I just saw it for the first time just recently. So don't forget, midterm is next week. I know the syllabus says it'll be live for 8 hours. That's actually holdover language from an old hybrid course. This is my first time teaching this as a strictly online module, which is why it takes me forever to get the lecture done, because I have to build it every week. I'm going to put it up probably Wednesday of next week, like around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then it will be up until 4 o'clock on Friday. So 4 o'clock Wednesday to 4 o'clock Friday. You'll get one chance to do it in that 48-hour window. Um, and it'll be timed. You'll have 2 hours to complete it. Um, it should be fairly simple if you've watched these lectures and watched the pieces. There's not going to be questions about anything else. Everything I'm asking will be in the lectures or will be in the pieces that we watched. It's 50 questions, 2 points each. Multiple choice, matching, true or false, fill in the blank. That's it. No essay questions, nothing tricky. It will just test you from module 1 to module 4. And then after the midterm, you can drop all of this because unless it comes back in another module as something else at another time, you don't need to remember it. So don't forget, midterm next week, you will have 48 hours between 4 p.m. Wednesday and 4 p.m. Friday next week to get it done. It shouldn't even take you a couple of hours, but you will have 2 hours to complete it. Going back to the kind of first day of the lectures that I recorded, I'm not going to say that it's not an open notes midterm because you are taking the class online and you are working at home. And if you use your notes, how am I ever going to know? But do keep in mind that there is a 2-hour time limit on it. So if you have to look up every single answer in your notebook, you may not complete it in time. So I would go back and review all of at least the recorded lectures and the videos from the first module for sure, just to make sure you're kind of tight on that stuff. If you've watched the pieces, you should be fine. I don't think I'm going to ask very many questions about the pieces, but most of the questions are going to come directly from my lectures. So if you are familiar with these lectures, you should do fine on the midterm. Again, I don't design this class to be difficult or boring, so hopefully it is neither. Groovy. That's all I have for you guys this week. So Module 4, you're going to do this. You're going to watch Midsummer. You're going to do your discussion post. Everybody's going to do the discussion post by Monday at midnight, Monday 11:59 p.m. next week. All right. You're going to do your essay question by then, and you are going to do your quiz by then. And then you will have Wednesday to Friday, 48 hours, 4 p.m. Wednesday to 4 p.m. Friday to take your midterm. And then Sunday night, Module 5 will launch. Maybe Monday night. You know how I am. I can't seem to win for losing in this class. But anyway, thank you for your patience with this. I'm sorry, I have such a crazy full house right now, and it's insane here. So if I don't get it recorded late at night or first thing in the morning, I don't get it recorded. I am going to edit this now and get it uploaded and get everything posted. I hope you all have a great week. I look forward to reading your Module 2 essay questions, those I haven't read, and your Module 3 stuff as it comes in. Great. Have a great week. Bye-bye.